Okay, so then that was easier with practice, and that kind of led you into, this is my favorite, one of my favorite stories about your history as a filmmaker, to your second feature, which is C.O.G, which is based off of a short by David Sedaris, which is one of his a chapter in one of his books.
Yeah.
And it's also the movie that we met.
Yeah,
I was your B camera on, which was awesome, up in Portland, Oregon. It was a beautiful, fun shoot, awesome crew. But tell us about that story, because I find it really interesting, because David Sedaris, who's a well-known author, and he had never really given anyone rights to any of his work before to make a feature.
Yeah.
And here you are, a young filmmaker, one feature under your belt, and tell us what happened.
Well, I had always wanted to do that. So I feel like everyone always has those conversations. They're like, would make a great movie. And I always like, that one essay in that book would make a great movie. And people had always, I'd been aware of people always trying to make a David Sedaris movie because I was a fan of his like anyone else's, but I didn't think his work was inherently like cinematic or worthy of making into films. I think just because something's a great book or someone's a great writer, it doesn't mean that they should be. But he wrote this one story that I thought had a structure to it that would be interesting in a movie, and it reminded me of a lot of the indies I loved from the 90s, the Jesus' Son and all the Todd Solondz's work and Alexandra Payne, like Citizen Ruth. It kind of had this tone I felt that I wasn't seeing that much in movies anymore. That had sort of given way to Quirk, and Quirk had become the overriding feature of like successful indie comedies for a long time, and I was more interested in the earlier, darker stuff that I grew up on. And I always thought I'd make a great movie, and then I got agents for my first film, and I thought, well, I had been trying to call his reps after I made the first movie. I just tried to call, and they were like, look, we're sorry, we don't do, it's his policy, he's passed on stuff now, he's not interested in a film. And I was like, well, this one's different, it doesn't have his family, I'm not gonna try to cast someone that looks or sound like him, I just want this story. And they were still like, look, we're sorry, they were perfectly pleasant, but it's their job to say, hey, no. So then I signed it with agents at a bigger agency, and I thought, well, now's my chance. Now that when they call, they're gonna, and they still couldn't get through. So it was like, oh wait, this is really like a policy. And I remember talking to my reps once, and I said, well, what else can I do? I don't want to go to sleep on this yet. And one of them was like, well, the best you can do is just go to a book signing of his and talk to him. And I was like, is this really, this is what I'm left with? Like any crazy person could do that. And so I was like, okay, well, I got to try doing this. And my first film had been based on another This American Life writer. And they knew each other a little bit. So I knew I wouldn't be 100% a stranger. And so I went up and I had a copy of the first film and I gave it to him and I said, look, I made this movie about Davy Rothbart, and if you have time to watch it, I'd love...
This is easier with practice.
Easier with practice, yeah. And I was like, if you have time to watch it, and if you like it, I'd love to talk to you about some ideas. And I walked away that night just being like, you know what, this is okay. This is my best. If I walk away with that, you have to have that feeling of like, you go one step beyond that, then you become creepy or stalker too, and your ambition gets the better of you. And it took like 4 or 5 months, but then I got an email from him saying, hey, watched your film. I mean, it was one of those moments you get an email, you're like, oh my God, like this, wait, huh? Like I thought it was a prank even at first. And it was him saying, oh, I like your film, and I think at that point, someone, his reps, or somehow he connected the dots, and he was like, so why C.O.G, like why this story? It got his curiosity in a way I thought it would, because it's not a beloved story of his, the stakes were lower, I think, for him with this story, which is what my gut had told me. And that opened the opportunity for me to sort of pitch my take, what I wanted the movie to look and feel like, which I think is really reflected in the final movie, and how I wanted it to be sort of a product of his work, but not indebted to his work. And I think I don't totally know, but that was enough for him to say, oh, okay, sure, go ahead. And maybe he'll do it again one day for a filmmaker, I don't know. I think mine was just a pure anomaly. He did it out of decency. I mean, he didn't pocket much money on it. It was a small movie, it didn't serve him. I mean, he can book a global book tour in a heartbeat, you know what I mean? It served very little interest of his other than just to be a good guy. And that's rare. Not everyone out there is like that. And so I was really grateful for it, but it came with the burden too of like, oh shit, now I really have to do this. And so when I wrote the script, people then were like, oh wait, this is darker than we thought it was going to be, or like, where is the Sedaris quality? I was like, no, this is going to be my movie. This is what I've been saying all along. This is why David said yes. And so yeah, then that's how it became, challenging to put together.
What is C.O.G? What's the story about?
It's not like easy to sum up. It was just sort of about this time that David spent in Oregon this summer. He spent there working at an apple factory, or first in the apple fields, and then he goes in the apple factory, and it sort of had this. I think like a lot of his best stories, that they're portraits of like a town or a place and the people in them. And I was sort of interested in a movie that didn't have a specific beginning, middle, and end. It was more episodic. Those are challenging movies to make though, because the audience, a lot of times, you can divide them. And I think I did with that movie. I was okay with that. I knew that was gonna happen. You can divide them because they're like, wait, if these are just episodes, what's the bigger picture? And for me, the bigger picture is, you just sort of you're trying to create a feeling, or a mood of it, as opposed to a specificity of where the story begins or ends. And so it's just sort of about this time that he works, and sort of how his life starts to intertwine with the religious right that kind of goes against his natural instincts, but he sort of starts to fall into the comforts of it. And I think deals with like sexual politics along with religious politics in a way that is hopefully kind of funny, but maybe also a little upsetting. That was sort of the, and that was my initial email to David. Said, I want half the people to think they just saw a comedy, and the other half to think they saw a drama. And for better or worse, that's what the movie is. Yeah,
it is. That's a great way of putting it.
Have you opened your heart up to Jesus? I'm talking about the Lord.
I think that religion is meant for people who aren't smart enough to understand how the world really works.
The Bible says.
I know what the Bible says.
Well, then what's your problem?
It's poorly written.
What are the challenges of making a short story that's not yours, adapting it into a full-length feature film? I mean, how did you tackle that?
I had so much naivety that I'm glad I had, because I was deliberately working against the classic Sedaris, like tropes and voices and things like that, that he's known for, because I was trying to do something different. The first film was based on like an 6-page article, and that one had a lot of expanding. This one was like 30 or 40 pages, so it was like a trove. I was like, oh my God, there's so much here, But I find actually in a lot of ways that short stories sometimes serve filmmaking better than novels do. In a weird way, if you had to be arbitrary about it, it's like the short story is the feature, the novel is the TV series. In a lot of ways, I mean, that's not the case for all things, but there is a lot more there in short stories, I think, that communicates to how a film works than people realize. I usually try to, when I'm looking for material, I'll start with short stories, or I'll start with articles, or whatnot, because usually films are usually the films that work the best. We're not talking about epics, we're talking about the indie films that work the best, usually have like one really core central idea. Novels are usually bigger and more ambitious than that, and more layered, traditionally speaking, as opposed to like a short will be that thing that has the one really snappy idea that you sit there with it for an hour and then it's gone, and that's usually there's a lot of opportunities to mine greatness from short stories.
I can't imagine being responsible for anyone but myself.
It isn't as hard as it looks.
What do you think of when you look at that?
Everything I've ever bought, every piece of food, it all comes with its own history. There's some miserable person rubbing their grubby little fingers all over it.
C.O.G.
Are you gonna tell me what it means?
Child of God.
Oh, God, those apples are in pesticide!
And so David Sedaris, who had never given rights to anyone before, right? Always said no, gives you the rights. One would think that with him being so guarded, he would be hands-on, walking you every step of the way. You can't do this, you can do this. But I understand that was not the case. Explain to us what it was like collaborating or not collaborating with him, and what kind of rules there were when he gave you full reign to make this movie.
His attitude, and it was Davy Rothbart's also, who Easier Practice was based on. It was different for Stanford. And we could talk about that in a second. Was that he just was like, well, if you're saying you want to go make a movie that's your own movie, that just I happen to have written this story you think would make a good movie, then go do that. He was like, then that's very rare. That takes a lot of humility and selflessness to just say, go. Well, then if that's what you're saying you're going to do, then I don't want to interfere. He's also filmmaking isn't interesting to him. I think he likes films, but the actual process, he wasn't like, I want to see what it's like to be on set and see someone be me on set. No, he was just, he was touring probably at the time, but for him, that was not a romantic notion for him.
So, up in Portland, Oregon, not in Los Angeles, which is where you live, which is the mecca of production. What was it like getting the crew, getting the fun, working with a budget, And I know Portland has a good infrastructure for production, but
Yeah, I mean, Portland had a good basis, and there's enough indie filmmakers up there that they've created a sort of a group of people that understand what a production like this is. I mean, my first film had shot in Albuquerque, which is, I actually love shooting in both those places. Albuquerque is a little bit more traditional. It's very by the book. It's very union. It's very, people have been shooting westerns there forever. So that's what it reflects like. Portland had a little bit more of a, what do you picture Portland to be like? A little more of a like, okay, you get to sort of like a little more piecemeal, you can put it together, and they were just different experiences. But I think whenever you go somewhere else to shoot a film, you always have to kind of remind yourself, you're a visitor there. Like in a weird ways, the crews have a certain control over you that you need to, because you're in their territory. And I think you need to be respectful of that in order for it to work well. I think if I just showed up and tried to be like, I want this, and this is how I want it, that's how you start hearing, terrible stories of unsafe productions and bitter people and those kind of things. And mostly these are small movies, no one's getting paid well. So you have to try to be as sort of warm about that as you can when you go somewhere else, and try to utilize the best of the people that you can get, and whatever, depending on whatever else is shooting there, all those kind of things. It's very complicated to go somewhere else. Because you sort of have to bend yourself to the will of the location. And look, I mean, the weird thing is when you're a director, you're a producer, like your leadership is lonely. It is. It's always going to be. No matter how collaborative you are, no matter how warm and welcoming you are with people, no matter what, like you're still there, you're still in a position that is solitary. And so you're never gonna make everybody happy. And the job isn't to make everybody happy, but I also think the job isn't to make people unhappy. And some people think that way. I think the job is to say, well, we've got to get the movie going, but we also want to treat people well, and we want it to be safe, and we want to get through our days, and we want everyone to. Filmmaking is this weird thing, right? You're going to take let's say 100 people, just for a round number, even though it was way less than that, but you're suddenly going to bring 100 people together who have never worked together, or at least not in this capacity, and then suddenly expect them to work at an incredibly fast clip, with no training and within moments, and have that last for only 4 weeks, and then call it a day. Like there was that's like just like bad business. That's bad team building. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like no corporation in the world would do that. No. And so it's a tricky thing to try to make that happen.
So fast forward a little bit. You go to Sundance with this film. Mm-hmm. Well, take us to the premiere. You're there with David Sedaris. What was that like? Sharing the spotlight, but sharing that moment with him. I
mean, it was great. It was like what I worked for all those years, was that opportunity to sort of say, hey, I told you I was going to do this thing, and I did it. And not only that, I think I kept the integrity of I think if I were to pull up that original email I wrote back to him, I feel like the cornerstone of what I said I was going to do is there. It all comes down to just like putting your brain. You go from the fantasy of like, oh, this would be a cool thing to do, then to actually being the person to say, let's go do this. What are the steps I need to take? And that's, to me, is always the most exciting place. I mean, I still experience that now when I have read bigger scripts or other books or whatever. It's still that feeling of like, you're reading it, and then when you try to, I mean, I guess maybe why I like the idea of adaptation, or even just reading a script and then going and making it into a film, is taking that, whatever is in your head when you're reading it, and then making that a reality is fun. It's, adult Legos in a way. That's like the joy of production in a lot, because production itself is like a very, not a great process. It's not, it's like not fun. So you have to find a way to make it fun.